to welcome and thank all of our participants, including researchers, business representatives, and the members of the media for your interest in U.S. and East Asia economic affairs. We are currently witnessing increased uncertainty driven by unprecedented trade tensions. Fortunately, Friday of last week, trade conflict between the U.S. and China has diminished in part due to a partial trade agreement, but there is still a feeling of insecurity towards phase 2 of the trade deal. The long-running subsidy dispute between U.S. and EU has been aggravating the uncertainty of global economic and trade environment. Concerns are mounting over a possible global economic slowdown, and the international economic institutions are making downward revisions to growth forecast for 2020. In order to expand economic growth, we must eliminate these uncertainties and promote international division of labor and continuous cooperation. In this regard, I sincerely hope today's seminar will serve as an opportunity for us to discuss constructive measures for further enhancing the trade on the basis of close economic cooperation among Korea, Japan, and the U.S. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chairman Kim Young-ju, for your remarks. I welcome you and your team to Washington. You brought us some rain, which we welcome. I guess there have been typhoons in both Japan and Korea, but we have maybe hopefully a little gentler rain here. I really do appreciate our partnership with the Korea International Trade Association, all the work that is done over the years to build the partnership between our countries and the work we've done together. I want to welcome everyone, as I said, in particular Congressman Joe Wilson, who will be speaking to us in a moment. We really appreciate your joining us today, Congressman. We know of, and I've learned from you just talking earlier, of your very deep commitment to strengthening the ties, not only of trade, investment, but of friendship between the United States and the Republic of Korea and Japan. And I know that particularly extends to your home state, but I thank you as an American for all you do. Now, it's, standard to open up and someone has to say why the topic of this gathering is timely and relevant, but in this case, I don't think I need to belabor that point. We have an overflow audience today, a very expert audience, as well as panel. But let me just say, obviously, the relationship between Japan and the Republic of Korea is important. It's an understatement, not only to the two countries themselves. It's of vital importance to the United States, both as a security ally and economic partner of both countries. But of course, it goes even beyond that. In recent months, some have said that the relationship between Tokyo and Seoul has spiraled to what some people call its lowest point since normalization in 1965. Some have even questioned whether what has been termed the quasi-alliance between Tokyo and Seoul is over. This has broad implications, obviously, I think, for the region and the world. But the intent today, there's a lot of talk in all the think tanks of Washington, is to focus not so much on how we got here or to ascribe responsibility or blame, but rather to think through what the impact will be and what will be the likely if the current trajectory of Tokyo and Seoul tensions continue or if they shift. And particularly thinking about, of course, the steps that have been taken in both countries and both capitals with respect to export controls and what the impact is not only on the respective economies, but on the global trade and economic order, a system, of course, already under considerable stress from a variety of factors, including some that do emanate right here in Washington, D.C. So we have an excellent panel, I think, to do just that. It's a tall order. As I kind of, again, mentioned, we're not asking our panelists to focus on history. Someone has to say history here, either recent or more distant. It's not because history is unimportant. Talking with the congressman who's American, history matters, context matters. We in the U.S. have seen this afresh in our own country in recent times. I have to say, I spent a good deal of my diplomatic career working on what is sometimes euphemistically called conflict resolution, or diplomacy, in the Balkans and Northern Ireland. And about the former, Winston Churchill said, "The Balkans produce more history than they can consume." In Northern Ireland, when I landed there for the first time to help negotiate a peace settlement, which took about 3 years and is now under stress again, the wag in the seat next to me leaned over as we were landing at Aldergrove Airport in Belfast, and he whispered, "You're now arriving in Belfast. Set your watch back to 1690. In both cases and in our own country, history does matter, did matter, and it's important to address it as we forge a better and more forward-looking relationship. But what's also notable to me as an outsider, but as a friend, I hope to both the Republic of Korea and the people of Japan, is that despite a painful and difficult history and the ongoing need to understand and address it, over the last half-century, Korea and Japan have built a modern relationship based on shared values of free and open markets, democracy, and important cultural and people-to-people ties. This is a precious thing. And the United States over the years has played a role in supporting and encouraging the building of those ties, and I hope in the coming days it will deepen its efforts to play a positive and important role going forward. But now it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Joe Wilson, the U.S. Representative from South Carolina's 2nd District. He was elected to the U.S. Congress in 2001. I've talked fast. He's coming up. Sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us. Thank you for commitment. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador and Chairman Kim, and I appreciate KEI and KETA having me here today, and fellow friends of Korea. It's such an honor for me to be here with you, and I like to point out that my appreciation of the people of Israel Asia is because of my family, and that is my dad served in the Flying Tigers in World War II, and so he served in India and China. He was at Kunming, Shangtu, Xi'an to help liberate China and liberate Korea. And so with this, he told me how hardworking the people of Asia are, and it's just given me such a wonderful perspective, but it really, a country that shows has been a beacon for the rest of Asia is the Republic of Korea. And then their shared relationship with my being born appreciating it, but the American people. There's not a greater indication of the love and affection of the people of the United States for the Republic of Korea and the Korean people than the extraordinary monument here on the mall recognizing the Korean War. The love and affection that Americans have for Korea, and then the success. What a message that you've made to the rest of the world. And as I run into veterans who have served in here or served in Korea, and I've told them over and over again, what a difference you made. You left a country which was an ash. There was not a bridge left in Seoul. And then you go now, and the most prominent feature as we visit Seoul are a forest of high-rise condominiums, 40, 50 stories tall, as far as you can see. And this was made possible because of the relationship we have between the United States and Korea. And so we're so grateful. And then the military alliance that we have, how critical. I've visited Camp Humphreys. I've visited the joint exercises with Korean American forces. And then I have another perspective. Chairman Elliot Engel, a good friend of mine of another political party, can you imagine, who's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he and I are the only two members of Congress who have been to Pyongyang. And we have seen the contrast. What we saw when we were there was totally contrived, staged, of Potemkin Village, which is the exact opposite of the Republic of Korea, which is real and opportunities. And then I've actually seen another reason I was happy to mention India. And you've been a beacon for the people of all of Asia, because Prime Minister Narendra Modi has adopted free market capitalism, changing from Fabian socialism, and the consequence is that there are now 400 million middle-class Indians, a great market for Korea. And so all of this fits together. And then investments. I want to thank you. In my home state of South Carolina, Samsung last year completed an investment adjacent to the district that I represent, creating over 1,000 jobs, making microwave ovens and refrigerators, making appliances. What a success story. But it also shows, too, that we can be working together, because also in the district that I represent, we have a Bridgestone tire facility, a Japanese investment, over $1 billion, nearly 2,000 employees. And so the trilateral investments that we have working together are so beneficial. And we need to focus on that and focus, as the ambassador I appreciate so much, on the future, because the future is bright, working together of our three countries. And I just look forward in every way to addressing this. And then I want you to know how important, again, the Korean American community is. Next Saturday, I'll be at the Korean Festival in Columbia, South Carolina. If you're nearby, please come by. And it's one of the most fun events of the year that I have the opportunity to go. And Pastor Kim is so good at the Korean Presbyterian Church to let me speak every year. And it's from the heart that I express my appreciation of the Korean American community. They've got little booths set up with Korean art, with artifacts, with Korean food. You would feel right at home. And so again, the Korean American community is so beloved, not just in South Carolina, but across the country. So I want to thank you for the opportunity of being here, and then extend another invitation, and that is for you or your family. If you're ever on Capitol Hill, you're welcome to come by 1436 Longworth House Office Building. The office that I have, I'm very humbled, has a window that overlooks the U.S. Capitol building, and we would be very honored for you to come and have a picture taken with the dome of the Capitol on your shoulder. And as you stand there, you will look around and see a flag of the Republic of Korea, but you'll see artifacts. I am a collector, and so I have many items that you will note right away come from Korea because of our affection and appreciation of the people of Korea. So best wishes on a wonderful conference, and I'm just so pleased that we're looking to the future of working together and so beneficial to the people of Asia, to the people of North America. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Congressman Wilson. I think we all really appreciate those comments, and especially your talks about looking towards the future, which is very important. Now, if we could take, and I'll ask our panel to come up, and we'll begin the panel portion of the program. Thank you. So I think we're very fortunate today to have four really great experts up here, and I sincerely mean that. We have people with a depth of congressional experience, a depth of trade experience, a depth of business experience, a depth of experience in the region, so we're very fortunate. I'd like to take, so we can ensure as much time for Q&A, I'm just going to give brief introductions. You all have their full bios with you, but to my immediate left, we have Dr. Marcus Nolan, who is the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. From 2009 to 2012, he served as the Institute's Deputy Director. Dr. Nolan was previously also a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. He has also received fellowships sponsored by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Council for International Exchange of Scholars, and the Pohang Iron and Steel Corporation, which you might know more commonly as POSCO. To Marcus's left is Stephen Ezell, who is the Vice President for Global Innovation and Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where he focuses on science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade, manufacturing, and the services sector. He is also the co-author of Innovating in a Service-Driven Economy, Insights, Application, and Practice, and Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage. Prior to joining ITIF, he co-founded Peer Insight, an innovation research and consulting firm to study the practice of innovation services, and he's also been an entrepreneur in the services sector as well. To his left is Lori Prater, who currently serves as the Policy Director and Tax and Trade Counsel for Congressman Mike Kelly, who is a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee with jurisdiction over trade, tax, healthcare, and Congressman Kelly is also the co-chair of the Korea Caucus. Ms. Prater has worked on Capitol Hill for nearly 2 decades and has also worked as the Director of Government Relations for the Information and Technology Industry Council, a leading information technology association representing the top 50 high-tech companies in Washington, D.C. To her left is Shioko Goto, who is the Deputy Director of Geoeconomics and the Senior Northeast Associate at the Wilson Center's Asia Program. She is a leading expert on economics and politics in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as U.S. policy in the region. Shioko is also a contributing editor to The Globalist and was a fellow for the Mansfield Foundation, Japan Foundation, U.S.-Japan Network for the Future from 2014 to 2016. With that, Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, although I share Ambassador Stevens' trepidation about weighing into the histories of South Korea and Japan. But that is exactly what I'm going to do. So let me, because I'm the first speaker and I'm supposed to set the context. So I'll take the bullets for the other three. Okay, so let me start out by making the following observation. South Korea and Japan have fundamentally ethnic or racially conceived notions of nationalism. And we can go into the intellectual history of why that is the case. That's different from the United States, where historically we've conceived as nationalism, citizenship, as being civic-based. You bear allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. That makes you a U.S. citizen. That makes you an American. That's what motivates you. We can't tell who an American is just walking down the street by looking at them or listening to them talk. So because of their historical trajectories, the issue of nationalism has been effectively captured in South Korea by the left, and in Japan by the right. So a situation in which you have a left-wing South Korean government and a right-wing Japanese government is a particularly volatile situation, because historically both politicians in both countries, I would argue, have used nationalism in a rather cynical way, and appealing to emotion, what in the United States we would call waving the bloody shirt, in the run-up to elections. It used to be in South Korea, you could time the appearance of the word tokdo on the front page of a newspaper by just looking at when the next election was. You would never hear anything about tokdo until about 6 weeks before the election, and suddenly tokdo would become an urgent concern of national interest. Okay, so far this is all standard. One could have said the same thing I just said anytime in the last 70 years. So what's different? Well, what's different this time is, or what makes this episode different, is that North Korea has shown some more adroit diplomacy, and I think more importantly, the relative absence of the United States, which normally in the past would have used its convening powers to essentially act as the adult in the room and try to tamp down tensions between its two allies. So that's kind of the overview, and let me then go through a bit of the detail. So what happened in North Korea was in 2017, 2018, they shifted towards a less confrontational stance, and specifically in the 2018 New Year's message, appealed to South Korea, and to enable himself to take advantage of this outreach, President Moon began distancing himself from Japan. And that was sort of pushing on an open door in the sense that one would have expected President Moon to have a fairly forward-leaning pro-engagement policy towards North. Now, as a matter of fact, since then, relatively little progress has been made, and you can argue that the North Koreans have treated President Moon quite badly. But nevertheless, that was the opening North Korean move that kind of set this in motion. Then in October and November of last year, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled in favor of South Koreans forced to work for Japanese companies during colonial rule, and that the 1965 treaty does not cover comfort women because it does not recognize the illegality of Japanese colonial rule. And I'm just reading from my notes, and I think that's the last time I'll use this phrase. I actually don't think comfort women is a very good phrase. I think sex slaves would be a more accurate characterization. Then in November 2018, President Moon unilaterally dissolved the Comfort Women Accord, which was in fact unpopular in South Korea. It had basically been negotiated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs without much public input, and when the old ladies denounced the agreement, South Korea was in a difficult position. So Japan asked for consultations as provided under that 1965 treaty, and when they were not forthcoming, initiated export controls on South Korea, removing it from the white list. And the key issue here is chemicals used in semiconductors, which I'm sure Steve will talk about in much greater detail. It is assumed that there's a commercial motivation in damaging South Korean rivals to Japanese firms, but it could also conceivably have some national security rationale or implications as well by impeding South Korean sales to China, where advanced chips in artificial intelligence are used in surveillance applications and other relevant applications. South Korea then responded by removing Japan from its own white list, filing a WTO case against Japan over the export controls. And it should be noted in this regard for this audience, as Troy said, I'm the Executive Vice President Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We normally do international economics, not South Korean and Japanese history. You may have figured this out. From the international trade standpoint, the guys at my institute were completely unaware of what I've talked about for the last 4 minutes. To them, this was a tit-for-tat reaction by the South Koreans over losing a case over pneumatic valves. So the South Koreans lost the case to Japan over pneumatic valves in the WTO. The Japanese had their press releases ready immediately when the appellate our court ruled. We're sort of doing end zone dancing and really kind of rubbing it in their faces. And so the South Koreans filed on this thing. Just how you see things kind of depends on where you sit. That action was then followed by indicating that South Korea would decline to renew the General Security of Military Information Agreement, a bilateral intelligence agreement, and that's, I think, when this stuff really got the attention here in Washington, the United States, because now it's starting to affect us. And the question now, and I guess somebody who's looking at the future will address this, is whether the Moon government will actually start seizing Japanese property in South Korea under the Supreme Court rulings. Okay. That brings me to the United States. So some have interpreted South Korea's withdrawal from the Intelligence Sharing Pact as a, quote, cry for help aimed at the United States. And indeed, normally, the U.S. would have acted with alacrity to bring its two allies together. If this was Seoul's aim, they have badly miscalculated. Our President Trump is inattentive, and resolving this issue would require a degree of serious sustained personal involvement in diplomacy for which he has shown no stomach. Indeed, as the impeachment effort here ramps up, his involvement in foreign affairs is likely to grow even more uneven and episodic. To the extent that now, the one thing I guess South Korea has going for it is to the extent that the United States has a policy towards North Korea, it leans towards engaging North Korea in diplomacy, and in that regard would imply distancing itself or sort of having some tension with Japan. That said, the U.S. and Japan just reached a minor trade agreement, so perhaps the administration is feeling more positively disposed towards intervening to help its allies reconcile. So this leads me to my conclusion with, V.I. Lenin's famous phrase, what is to be done? And honestly, when I look at the list of things I have to be done, it's a pretty meager list. One possibility would be for Japan to soften its position on North Korea. Fat chance with the North Koreans doing medium-range missile tests capable of hitting Japan. One could, as some South Korean commentators have argued, encourage South Koreans to protest against President or Prime Minister Abe, not Japan, to at least differentiate and recognize that you have a right-wing government in Tokyo which uses nationalism very similarly to the way some politicians in Seoul do, emotive appeals to secure their electoral positions. And so at least try to differentiate within Japan. Rely on the protracted WTO process. Now, So back to my international trade hat, the WTO is basically falling apart. And the reason is, there was reasons why we have trouble negotiating more. But importantly from this standpoint is, the way it works in the WTO is first you have consultations, then you have a case that, if the consultations can't resolve the issue, it then goes to a panel that rules on the dispute, the so-called dispute settlement panel. And then if you don't like the ruling you get from the panel, you can go to an appellate body. Well, the U.S. is effectively in the process of strangling the WTO by simply refusing to allow new judges to be appointed to the appellate body. So sort of like the Federal Election Commission here in the United States, we're going to reach a situation where the appellate bodies they actually can't form panels. And so then the dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO really is basically disabled. I personally think that is, in fact, the goal of this administration, which is the individuals involved in trade policy never like the WTO. They want to move back to something akin to the GATT, and so that's what they're doing. Setting that aside, putting it in the WTO has the advantage of, it's not the two countries at loggerheads, it's a dispassionate, third-party type resolution, and two, it is protracted. And that will give time to work things out and let cooler heads prevail. And finally, the one which is more a hope than a policy recommendation is it would be nice to see the United States get back involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Stephen?
Well, thank you, Troy, and to KEI and KETA for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. I'm Stephen Ezel. I'm the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Troy, were we able to get the slides
Yes.
up? While he's doing that, I'll tell you a bit about our foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan science, technology, and economic policy think tank. Actually ranked the #1 science and tech policy think tank in the world by the University of Pennsylvania Global Go-To Think Tank Index. But our mission is to advocate for public policies that drive innovation-based economic growth in the United States, in our states, and in countries around the world. We work on innovation across a wide variety of industrial sectors, from clean energy and life sciences to manufacturing. And my role as the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy has me focusing on how countries can construct national innovation systems that drive innovation, and on architecting a global economic system that maximizes the output of innovation-based industries. Well, Troy asked me to talk about supply chains and the effect of the disputes on the semiconductor supply chain in particular. And in dealing with semiconductors, we're really dealing with probably the world's most uniquely integrated global industry. If you really want to understand how the global semiconductor industry, $1.5 trillion industry operates, there is no better report for you to read than Nathan Associates' report, Beyond Borders, the Global Semiconductor Value Chain. Wonderful example from that report shows that the typical semiconductor production process spans multiple countries. 4 countries, 4 states, 3 trips around the world, 25,000 miles traveled, 100 days in transit, or 100 days in production, and 12 days in transit to produce the semiconductor that shows up in your car or mobile phone. It's truly an integrated global industry where enterprises and industries within countries specialize in various facets of the phases of the semiconductor production process. There are really 3 key phases to the process. First, of course, the upfront design of the circuit. The design process is IP intensive, very high value, and concentrated among a very few specific firms across the world. Once we have a semiconductor design prepared, of course, we have to manufacture it. The manufacturing process has 2 key inputs to it. So a set of companies around the world, like Applied Materials, Kela, Tincor, make critical equipment used in the manufacturing of semiconductors. Japan and the United States really specialize in the development of the machinery that prints the semiconductors. But the manufacturing activity itself occurs in a number of locations around the world, the United States, Korea, Japan, and the semiconductor manufacturing process itself requires imported specialized chemicals in the machinery. It's highly capital and IP intensive, very high value, and again concentrated across only a few firms. To give you a sense of the scale involved in the capital intensity in semiconductor manufacturing. Taiwan's TSMC is just announced the world's newest semiconductor factory going down to the 3 nanometer level. It's going to take them $20 billion to build the factory that can support that production process, so it's highly capital intensive. And then there's an assembly, testing, and packaging process that occurs once the manufacturing is complete. And the key point I want to make here is that this specialization in the global industry has given rise to a number of operating or business models that different companies from different countries look to focus upon. So some companies like Qualcomm or AMD or Broadcom only focus on the design of the semiconductor, and then they will hand it off to a foundry model, often in Taiwan, where a firm like TSMC will take the design for a mobile phone chip that Qualcomm makes and then prints it out for them. That's called the foundry model. Then there's a separate operating model called IDM, or integrated device manufacturer. And these are vertically integrated companies like Samsung, Intel, Infineon, Texas Instruments, and these companies control the entire vertical stack from how that microchip is designed, and they print it in their own factories, and then they may hive off some of the package and assembling to other places around the world. But the point is there's a diversity of business models that the global industry pursues. Okay, with that as a level setter, what does this mean for Korea? What's at stake for Korea? Well, Korea, its semiconductor industry, has the world's second most overall fabrication capacity. Samsung and SK Hynix are the world's second and fourth largest semiconductor suppliers. And when we look at companies competing with this integrated device manufacturing business model, South Korean companies are responsible for 50% of global market share from that segment of the marketplace. Korea also accounts for fully a quarter of total global semiconductor wafer capacity. Now, obviously, this is a critical industry. And when you aggregate its effects up to the broader Korean economy level, you find that semiconductors directly are responsible for 20% of Korean exports. When you put related semiconductor industry activity like the package and testing, equipment manufacturing, semiconductor and related equipment accounts for 30% of Korean exports. In 2018, semiconductors accounted for 92% of Korean export growth. In 2017 and 2018, semiconductors accounted for 80% of Korea's current account surplus. So essentially, 80% of Korea's positive trade balance comes from this one sector. And it's estimated that the downside risk over the next 12 months going forward, if we can't resolve the dispute, are going to be to crimp South Korean GDP by as much as 2.6%. So what's at issue? What's the conflict? Well, as Marcus said, and as you know, over the summer, Japan removed South Korea from a white list of countries that are given preferential treatment with regard to export licensing. This has the potential to affect up to 1,120 products in total. But in particular, in July, Japan imposed specific export controls on 3 specific chemicals that are vital to the manufacturing of semiconductors. Notably, as you see here, the chemicals are hydrogen fluoride, fluorinated polyamide, and photoresistors. Now, this matters because Japan produces 90% of the world's supply of fluorinated polyamide as well as photoresistors. In the first 6 months of this year, Japan supplied 94% of Koreans' supply of hydrogen fluoride. And Japan overall accounts for 70% of global production of that particular chemical, hydrogen fluoride. I'll just give you a deep dive into one of these chemical processes, in particular, photoresistors. Photoresistors are essentially like a mask, and they establish the pattern upon which semiconductor microsecurity is built. You can't print a semiconductor without having access to this photoresistor technology. 90% of Korean photoresist imports in 2018 originated from Japan, and just 5 companies in particular within Japan. There are very few alternative international suppliers. In fact, there's only one in the United States, a startup in Portland, Oregon. And it's estimated that the available stockpiles that Korean companies have would only last 3 to 6 months. So the takeaway is that Korea's semiconductor industry is highly and vitally dependent upon the imports of these chemicals from Japan. In fact, whereas as this chart shows, the amount is not incredible in dollar terms. So on average, Korea imports $33.6 million of these restricted chemicals monthly from Japan. So it's just $44 million in value. However, Korean exports of $8.4 billion of semiconductors each month, 95% of the exports depend on having access to those chemicals. So in essence, the exposure, this essentially means that Koreans' potential export loss exposure is 250 times greater than what is faced by the Japanese suppliers. Now, a lot is going to depend upon how Japan's MIDI actually decides to go about this export licensing process. Will request by Japanese firms to provide these chemicals to Korean and other suppliers or consumers around the world be granted on a basis of predictability and alacrity, or will there be complications? Will this potentially be used for anti-competitive measures? I think that's an open question. But the reality with regard to the downstream supply chain impacts is obviously we've seen that Korean semiconductor firms themselves will be greatly affected. But the reality is that of the $100 billion of semiconductor exports from Korea over the past year, $97.9 billion worth of those exports found their way into products that were exported into the global economy. Only 2.7% of Korean semiconductor production is used for domestic consumption. What does this mean? This means that if this dispute cannot be resolved, if Korean semiconductor manufacturers cannot have a certain supply of these chemicals, prices are likely to increase, and that's going to have downstream effects on Samsung's ability to make mobile phones, data centers, other ICT equipment in the ICT goods sector, but it's also going to affect Koreans' exporter of capital goods like Kia cars and LG Electronics. It is of concern for the entire export structure of the Korean economy. So then, what are some of the broader international impacts and some policy recommendations? On this particular question, there is not a better resource for you in this world than a report released a couple weeks ago by the U.S. International Trade Commission by Sam Goodman, Dan Kim, and John Brouet, the South Korea-Japan Trade Dispute in Context, Semiconductor Manufacturing, Chemicals, and Concentrated Supply Chains. They really do an incredible job of going company by company, sector by sector, looking at downstream impacts. As I think they accurately argue in the report, especially firms like Intel in the US and Taiwan's TSMC that are going to have easier access, they don't have to go through the export licensing process, they're certainly going to be an advantage because they're going to have a more certain access to the supply of these chemicals. However, the report makes the case, which I think is quite credible, that, quote, over the long term, these actions create incentives for Korean chipmakers to significantly lessen their sourcing from Japanese suppliers, not only in specialized chemicals, but throughout the entire semiconductor value chain. I've worked with a lot of Japanese colleagues over the years, and they have been quite concerned about China's efforts to corner rare earth metals, rare earth materials. Japan has put in place a quite sophisticated program to look everywhere where China controls key metals and develop their own alternative sources of supply. I think Japan should reflect deeply that if they try to apply a similar set of actions to Korea, it will likely only invoke a very energized effort to look for alternative sources of supply to these chemicals. Now, I think the other key point we have to look at here is China, because China has put together something called the National Integrated Circuit, National IC Strategy. China will invest $160 billion in an effort to create its own indigenous semiconductor manufacturing sector. China has said that its goal with a national IC strategy is to, quote, eliminate foreign imports of semiconductors by 2035, reducing them in half by 2025. China seeks autarky in this sector. If we, between the United States, Korea, and Japan, do not create an ecosystem where we can support a vibrant market-based, enterprise-led, rules-governed system to develop semiconductors, I think we're all going to put ourselves at a deficit in terms of dealing with a Chinese competitor over the long term that does seek international leadership in this sector. So I hope that going forward, we are able to find an amicable resolution to this dispute and recognize that the system we have put in place to allow the global economy to produce low-cost yet extremely high-capacity information communications technology goods like semiconductors is the fundamental factor that's been responsible for unleashing a global digital revolution that creates new technologies like IoT, like artificial intelligence, like autonomous vehicles that will produce maximum output for the good of the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And just to add one sort of real-time context point to this, one of our interns here, and they all do great work, pulled a story for me this morning that has the data on sort of where we are on the etching gas, and that there was basically a monthly average import of $847 million a month, and that's now dropped to $27 million. So we can already see that while Japan has done some approvals, there's been a significant drop-off. With that, Lauren?
Thank you. I think Marcus actually did a great job kind of outlining kind of the history that those of us on Capitol Hill are now finally actually learning about, because it isn't usually, we kind of govern by crisis on Capitol Hill, if people don't notice that. And then fortunately, Stephen and I actually used to work around the corner because he was at the foundation and I worked for the kind of the company side, and then we frequently see each other at the gym. In our gym clothes, so it's nice to see him in a suit finally. So anyway,
I'm actually doing one.
I know. I was like, wow, I've never seen you all dressed up, but I like it. So anytime you want to wear that to the gym, feel free.
Do not try and keep up with this woman at the gym. It's impossible.
Or on the soccer field with him. So. Anyway, by way of background, Congressman Kelly is, as like I said, a senior member of Ways and Means Committee from Western Pennsylvania, and he's co-chair of the Korean Caucus. But I always say that's kind of his side hustle because he owns 5 car dealerships. He took over his father's dealership. So Cadillac, I can run through them now. Cadillac, GM, Kia, Hyundai, and now recently acquired Toyota. So he has spent a lot of time in Korea as a business person, and he's actively involved in Hyundai Hope on Wheels on Capitol Hill. So as his policy director and trade counsel, he's my 5th member that I've worked for, but actually by way of transparency, my father has actually ran a prototype fab out in Portland, Oregon. And so for when I was growing up and went to college, he said, you have to, this is the business you need to go into. You need to learn Japanese. So I suffered through 2 years of Japanese and science classes, and fortunately went and got my master's degree in political science and international relations, lived in Central Asia, and then went and got a law degree just to spite him, and then moved to Washington, D.C. and became a Republican. But I think, on Capitol Hill, we really have not been paying a lot of attention between the conflict between South Korea and Japan. We see both of them as allies, strategic. And so it's only very recently that I think, other than the kind of the history background, but this recent conflict is really relatively new on the radar screen for members. And unfortunately, I was hoping this panel would be on Friday because tomorrow, actually, which rarely happens, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce is actually coming up to brief staffers like myself on this conflict on export controls dispute, which rarely happens on the Hill. To have someone from the Commerce to come up and talk about other than what the administration's doing. So for issues for policymakers in America is, that Korea and Japan are trading partners, and much like in Korea's own trading partners are China, Japan, and the U.S. We've always seen China as our our greatest concern. And having been in China a decade ago, and then being there recently with the embassy, I think there is definitely cause for concern. It's been a sea change, and they make no bones about it that they are, for better to world. I mean, it's their belts and belts and what is it? Belts and Belt and Road. They're very clear that we want to dominate in the global economy, and so I think that is what's on most members' radar screens, and so I think for most members, hope that there could be some sort of resolution between Korea and Japan, and to the degree that they can be helpful, I think they would like to be. But in talking to sitting down with my boss, I said, what's kind of your perspective, the difference between Japan and Korea? He said, well, we went to war together, and there are members that served, the Ways and Means, in fact, he recently retired, but the former chairman of Ways and Means served in Korea, Charlie Rangel, and his portrait is in the Ways and Means room. And so we have more of a history, I think, shared history in his view with Korea, because we fought alongside each other. And so there is that history, I think, fresh in the mind of older members of Congress. If you talk to someone my age in the 40s, it's not as fresh in their history. But that's very much, for my boss, in his view, that's the link, and in addition to the trade relationship, that's our link. And Obama said himself is that this is one of my, I'll read his quote, but he also said that we have, quote, one of America's closest allies and greatest friends. And I had been in Korea right before Obama had come, and met with AmJam there before. But I mean, we really feel like we have it's one of our strongest allies in the region, and to the degree that we can hopefully mediate some of the tensions between Japan and Korea, I think members on the Hill don't know quite how we can be constructive. So hopefully, when the administration comes up tomorrow, they can give us some breadcrumbs on how to, or some indication. But I can say that, speaking on my own behalf, that the administration appears to, as one senior trade person on the Hill said, it appears we've started a trade war with everybody. And so we're just not sure how we're going to resolve that. So I think hopefully, whether offline or openly, if you could give us some indication on the Hill, I think, how best to approach both parties and how we can be constructive. Because at the end of the day, and to some degree, part of this comes out of our recent dispute with China. We are a global supply chain in the last, several decades, and I think with this administration, people are having to learn to the degree that we are a global supply chain. The notion that we're bringing everything back to the United States to manufacture doesn't make sense, even though people like the sound of that. But people also don't want to, and we don't want to pay a lot. We're a nation of consumers. We like free. We like free stuff. We like to go to Target. We like to go to Walmart. And if I think people really knew the cost of manufacturing in the United States, and we learned this to some degree during the tax, when there was a push for a border adjustment tax, which would have been regressive, and I think people didn't really understand how it would be regressive, but also it would have been incredibly expensive to middle to low income workers that shop at Target and Walmart. So I think with this recent administration, people are having to kind of understand where things are made. And my fear is if this isn't resolved quickly, people will start to learn that their Samsung phone, the one that I have at home, might start costing me a lot more. And that's when rubber hits the road for politicians, is that when people realize when they start having to pay double on things, that tends to gets the people on Capitol noticing.
And it creates a dynamic that further undermines faith in globalization.
Right. So I mean, it's so hopefully you guys have some good ideas. So and let us know what we can do on Capitol Hill. So with that, I'll pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Shioka?
So thank you, KEI, and thank you, Troy, for inviting me here today. Just to add, I was actually on Capitol Hill last week to give a briefing to congressional staffers on this very topic. So certainly there is a lot of appetite for understanding how we got here, and perhaps more importantly, how we can actually get out of this, and what the United States can do, if anything, to help ameliorate the situation. But when Troy first approached me a few weeks ago about this panel, I was actually reminded about a comment by President Trump made in late July when he was asked whether the United States could do something, whether he himself, President Trump, could do something about it. He said, quote, "It's like a full-time job getting involved with Japan and Korea." Unquote. So, like with many comments that the president makes, regardless of one's political stripe, there is often a kernel of truth in that. And certainly the idea of this issue, ongoing tension between Japan and Korea, is a very long-standing one. So it's not new, but it has escalated to the extent that many analysts of the region would argue this is the worst it's been since 1965. So I'd like to perhaps address why that is. What are the new elements? And I see four major developments. And the first one is the decoupling of economic and security interests from the politicization of history. And that actually no longer holds as true. So yes, we've had tension between Japan and Korea over the years, but there has been an understanding that because there is a mutual interest in economic and security issues, we can actually take the history issue and put it separate from the common objectives. But that they are no longer united by a common threat perception, particularly when it comes to North Korea and China. And it's especially true given the growing divide in how South Korea sees North Korea and its focus on reconciliation on the one hand, and Japan, which does not really share that perspective on the other. Of course, it's easy to say that Japan is the only country amongst the former six-party member countries to not have a bilateral summit meeting with Kim Jong-un. But beyond that cosmetic and summit diplomacy, there is a growing schism between Tokyo and Seoul about Korea's policies towards North Korea and its vision for the Korean Peninsula on the one hand, and Japan's continued concerns about the aggressions and the security threat posed by North Korea on the other. And so I believe that regardless of the history issue, this growing divide in how they see the North Korea's threat would have actually led to a greater schism in bilateral relations at this stage. The second new element that is leading to growing tensions is a shift in the regional economic hierarchy. Now, of course, Asia, the Indo-Pacific region, remains the most economically dynamic and the most robust economic region in the world. There is still a shared faith in trade and in globalization. And there is a continued expectation for growth, which really unites the region together. But that said, the international liberal order is in flux, and so too is the economic order in Asia itself. Now, Japan fell to third place in the global economic ranking in 2010, falling behind China. And that gap between Japan and China continues to grow. On the other hand, Korea has continued to go up that GDP ladder, and it is now in 12th place. And more broadly, across the region, countries are jockeying to move up in the GDP rankings, move up in the value chain, and diversify their economic foundations from export of goods to becoming leaders in the service sector and in the technology industries as well. And so that creates another source of tension, regardless of the history issue. And there's also the other element of the question of how to deal with China. And there is a difference between how Japan sees China as both a source of cooperation as well as competition, and the way Korea would assess China as competitor and a partner. And how to deal with this China challenge will continue to be a source of friction, not just for Japan and Korea, but for countries across the region. Just to elaborate a little bit more on the impact of the growing divide in economic hierarchy, we've talked a little bit about the 1965 treaty that normalized relations between Japan and Korea. Japan has continued to insist that this is the foundation in which bilateral relations have been established. Japan's argument would be that the treaty not only offered $500 million in grants and loans, which at that time was about 1.6 times more the size of South Korea's national budget, and that Tokyo also argues that at that time, compensation, not just compensation for not just physical damage, but also emotional damage was given as well. So that really remains Japan's argument. Japan says that this 1965 agreement should remain at the core of continued solid relations between the two countries, and that for Korea to renege on that treaty would be a violation, its violation of rules on international law, and it would upset global stability. But what I do want to insist upon is that the reality of 1965 is a very different one from the world that we do see today. I've already mentioned that the economic order in the world is in flux, and it certainly is a very different one from 1965, not to mention the differences in politics, and there is perhaps scope to reflect that as we try to move forward in bilateral relations. The third new element in increasing tensions between Japan and Korea is, we've already talked about this to some extent, but it's the uncertainties about the United States itself and Washington's ability to keep the trilateral relationship strong. Now, Washington has traditionally played a pivotal role in ensuring security relations and that they remain stable. It, for instance, took a not insignificant role in bringing together the 2015 so-called Comfort Women Sexual Slavery Agreement together, which since has been scrapped. Since the advent of President Trump, the United States has taken on a more isolationist approach in diplomacy as well as in trade relations. And dealing with the Korea-Japan relations is no different. We know that at the working level, there is continued strong commitment from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from Capitol Hill, and all those who are actively involved in Indo-Pacific affairs are alarmed by the latest developments, the continued tensions between Japan and South Korea. But how and whether the White House can actually be effective in bringing the two sides together really remains uncertain. Now, that doesn't mean that Seoul and Tokyo haven't tried to court Washington and to get the United States on their side. And Japan has certainly called upon the United States to support its position to ensure that Korea adheres to the 1965 agreement. and it has pointed out that as Japan and the United States signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which came into force in 1952, after that, American individuals have repeatedly approached Japan for compensation, but the U.S. official position has been to say that the San Francisco Treaty has normalized relations, and so that issue has already been resolved on a government-to-government basis. Now, the fourth element that adds a new wrinkle to tensions is the willingness to take on economic risks for political gain on both sides. And what we see is that the private sector is caught in the middle in both Korea and in Japan. And so we've seen, for instance, Korea demanding forced labor compensation to specific Japanese companies, calling for their assets to be sold to do so. And we've seen also that Japan imposed these export restrictions, although Tokyo continues to argue that the export restriction issue is not in any way a reaction against the Korean Supreme Court's decision or any military tensions that took place last year. Rather, that it is a response to national security concerns and the possibility of technology being leaked to North Korea. I do want to add, though, when it comes to the political element of Japan's decision to impose export restrictions, that often in South Korea, it was seen very much as a political ploy ahead of Japan's upper house elections, that it would be a way for Japan to rally around the national flag against Korea. The fact of the matter, though, is that the decision itself, the timing, I think, was not particularly planned ahead of the upper house elections. It certainly wasn't a major issue that drove further support for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. The election issues during the upper house elections in July this summer in Japan focused much more on broad economic issues such as the effectiveness of Abenomics, the current economic policies in play, or dealing with an aging population, or a growing income gap, everything but really this ongoing tension. But I should also add that the action, the Japan's decision to impose export restrictions did take a lot of analysts, both analysts in Japan as well, by surprise. And it certainly is the first time the trade ministry has been immersed head on in the broader dispute of persisting Korea-Japan tensions. And it's worth bearing in mind that under the latest cabinet reshuffle of the Japanese government, the then trade minister has become foreign minister, and there is this continuing thread of trade and foreign policy when it comes to dealing with South Korea. So, what is the impact of all of this? It's been just over 100 days since the export restrictions were imposed, and there has certainly been a slowdown in exports of the three critical materials that Stephen mentioned. It's certainly added more paperwork. It's become less efficient as a result. But I do want to stress the fact that this decision has had far bigger repercussions across the board beyond the technology sector, and the sale of consumer goods in particular has been hit directly by grassroots boycott movements, especially across Korea. And we see that, I was looking at this, and one of the biggest, the two big industries that have been hurt are cars and beer. Cars, it's down 60%, but it sounds big. But Japanese cars have never done well in the Korean market and vice versa. So the 60% decline still means only 1,398 units were sold. So overall, it's not that big. Well, what about beer? Beer, Japanese beer makes up about 16% of imported beer in Korea. But now that's gone down to 1.5%. And Asahi beer used to be the number one imported brand in Korea, but now it's fallen to 36th place. And that's really an active consumer boycott measure that really says, don't buy Japanese products in Korea. But perhaps the hardest hit has been tourism. This morning I saw that the Japanese Tourist Board reported a year-on-year decline of Korean tourists coming to Japan, falling by 58%. And that's been especially hard for smaller Japanese companies, which are very much focused on courting Korean tourists coming into the southern region of Japan. Nationwide there hasn't really been that big a hit, but as we expect these tensions to continue, these boycotting measures to continue, this general overall acrimonious relationship continue, we are expecting the numbers to continue to fall steadily, that go beyond the technology sector. Perhaps the silver lining in this is that the Japanese media has often been for the underdog, and the underdog right now is smaller companies, and they are really in the forefront of calling for normalization of relationships. But that said, we've already mentioned this before, but we are at a very precarious time in the global economy, and given the precarious state of global growth, a decline in GDP for either Japan or Korea could actually bode quite badly for the region at large, and we can actually see a spillover effect of growing populism and growing nationalism in both countries as well. I'd like to also share with you some public opinion data. A Japanese polling group called Genno found that relations between, the Japanese view of Korea has fallen steadily. And now about 50% of those polled in Japan have an unfavorable view of Korea. And in Korea, about 51% of those polled have an unfavorable view of Japan. However, there is good news. The good news is that there is a generational divide, and that 30% of Japanese under the age of 20 view Korea favorably, and 57% of Koreans under the age of 20 see Japan favorably. And perhaps the best thing is that travel actually improves impressions between the two countries. So even though we are at the height of these tensions, those who have traveled to Korea from Japan, 48% of them have a very favorable view of Korea. And for Koreans who have been to Japan, 38% of them have a favorable view of Japan. So how can we move forward on this? The reality is that geography cannot change, right? No matter what the situation is, Japan is going to be there and Korea is going to be there. And so that is the reality that we are dealing with. Perhaps it is time to think outside the box. And certainly I don't think there's going to be immediate improvement by looking at the political leadership of either side. The conclusion that I would reach here is that domestic politics is driving policies concerning bilateral relations, including economic policy. But the private sector does give me quite a lot of hope. The annual meetings of the CEOs of Japan and Korea actually went ahead in September in Seoul as planned. And 300 executives from both Japan and Korea got together, representatives from Samsung, Lotte, SoftBank, Canon. They all united and came out with a statement calling for normalization of relations. There is also some light, a glimmer of hope on the diplomatic front as well. The newly established Japanese emperor is having his coronation next week, and Korea has said that Prime Minister Lee Na-kyun will be at the coronation, and Prime Minister Abe has said that he will actually be having a bilateral meeting there. The Korean Prime Minister will be part of the official state banquet as well. The Korean Prime Minister will also be meeting with Japanese corporate executives at that time. So this can be seen as an opportunity to really kind of change a little bit of the narrative, if only for a very short period of time. But that said, the first and most immediate goal should be to go back to the status quo. And status quo meaning that we go back to this decoupling of a politicization of history on the one hand and focusing on common economic as well as security objectives on the other. There is no quick fix to this situation, but what I can say is that this relationship does need constant tending. Nothing should be taken for granted, and there are opportunities, incremental ways to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoko. So I would like to now take and move to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and give your name and affiliation. The gentleman here in the front. In the third row up here.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. I'd like to thank the panel for their comments. I'd like to go back to the question of whether there's a real alternative for South Korean semiconductor markets other than Japan. It seemed like in the presentation, China is the possible alternative, or is there an indigenous South Korean actions that can lessen this dependence? What is the real alternative? And certainly a closer relationship or dependence with China raises lots of political questions regarding the U.S.-South Korea alliance.
Do you want to take that, Steve?
Sure. So again, it's a question of inputs and outputs, right? The ITC report, I think, accurately states, quote, in the short term, China is unlikely to be able to capitalize on this dispute to gain further foothold in the global microelectronics value chain because its chemicals industry is not likely to be able to produce the kind of high-quality inputs required by state-of-the-art chip production. So at this point, China does not represent a credible alternative source of supply for the inputs of those critical materials. Japan really remains the lead global supplier. There are a couple of alternatives in the U.S. and Europe on the hydrogen fluoride side, but China would not be an alternative supplier base. Now, if your question is over the long term, could China represent a large enough market for Korean exports of its semiconductors to viably replace other markets like Japan? I think the problem that you run into there is China's stated goal to autarkically produce its own base of semiconductors and to eliminate their imports of foreign-produced semiconductors. for the foreseeable future, it doesn't seem like China is the solution on either the input or output end for the Korean quandary.
I would just add a couple other little details real quick. One, there are one or two small South Korean firms, and they're trying to see if they can ramp up production. And Samsung did a test run on some of the chemicals from its side. The South Korean government's also looking to try and invest more in indigenization or localization. The challenge with that is that, it's going to take time. You have the time it takes to basically build the production capacity, do the certification to make sure that it meets the standards that Samsung and SK need. And so in the short term, outside of, Stephen mentioned like Europe or the US or a couple other spots, there's probably not really many alternatives, at least not beyond sort of like maybe small amounts that they might need.
Taiwan might represent an option, though. LG is currently testing a Taiwanese hydrogen fluoride as a replacement for Japanese products. So in that one of the three, Taiwan might be a viable option.
Tammy?
Tammy Overby with McClarty Associates. It seems to me that the Korean importers are upset because they need the products. The Japanese suppliers are upset because they want to sell their exports to their Korean customers. So it does seem to be a political issue. Both sides are politicizing it. I understand that Korea and Japan have a parliamentary union that are meeting, and you have some members of the Diet and the National Assembly. And this is really for Lori, that perhaps there might be a role for the Korea caucus to urge them. Again, I know both business communities are talking quietly to their own government. Let's bring down the tensions, but perhaps there's a role that Congress could play as well. And just ask your thoughts on that, please.
And I certainly think it'll be interesting to see what the administration says tomorrow and see what they would like Congress to engage in and kind of get their temperature. I think that's what I'm going to do tomorrow, and see if that's something. Obviously, I think maybe from what I've understood, at least from our panelists, is that, what's the bandwidth of the administration? And so often I think our role on the committee but also in the Korea caucus is to maybe encourage the administration to play a more active role. Which seems to be across the spectrum on any number of things, but I think, often this might be, and my boss does have a good relationship with the president, and so this might be a good thing that we can play in our role as co-chairs of the Korean caucus to encourage the administration to more actively engage, to get to normalization sooner rather than later. So that's exactly what I was thinking. Good, thanks.
Gentleman here. Sorry, right here.
Paul Lowe, thanks very much, Ambassador Stevens and Chairman Kim, as well as the panelists, for a really timely discussion. You've described some of the near-term or the short-term losers, as it will. Are there any midterm to long-term winners if this were to persist? To anyone on the panel?
China and North Korea.
That's what we were saying.
That's at least for 3 of the 4 panelists. Maybe all 4 is unanimous opinion.
Right. And I mean, another way to think about this, just to put sort of like a data point to it, is if it persists, and that means Samsung has to shut down, or SK, production, not only does it then ripple through the consumer electronics side, but let's set that aside and pretend that they can get it elsewhere. That's a period to where Samsung and SK aren't going to be able to invest as much in innovation, which then means, yes, China's not going to catch up right away, but it helps to close that gap over time.
Just on that point, it's important to note that the semiconductor industry is the world's most R&D intensive. Globally, the industry invests about 20% of its R&D, or of its revenues every year in R&D, because you have to have the revenues from the 12 nanometer fab to fund the 8 nanometer fab to fund the 3 nanometer fab. So it's very important that we architect the global trade economic system in such a way that that virtuous cycle of innovation can flourish in this industry.
Michael here.
Yeah, thanks. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. You've addressed the U.S. Role and non-role in the conflict between Japan and Korea, but I'm wondering how you all think about what both China and Russia are doing about this, if they're addressing it or if they have any policies towards it. Abe is clearly working closely with Russia, and there's clear connections between South Korea and Japan, but China and Russia are also together. So how does that all, what's their role here?
China's already offered help. Xi Jinping has already offered to be a broker, an honest broker, especially when it comes to dealing with the economic impact or the fallout. And that has kind of been accepted tepidly by both Japan and Korea. But again, going back to this is not a vacuum. It will be filled, and China is quite eager to fill that void, the leadership void.
I haven't seen anything on Russia on this, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think generally with Russia, it's not exactly transparent. It's it's not, at least with China, I think they're fairly reliable. And
let me add,
right.
Russia is very anxious for both South Korea and Japan to invest in Russian parties.
Right.
Pushing very hard on them, so you think they engage.
I guess it's just not as transparent as I think, at least from the Russia side. I think China is very transparent with their goals. So I don't know if anybody else can speak to it.
The gentleman just right here.
Stephen, you mentioned that Japan has a program to identify exposure to rare earth elements and critical minerals and develop alternatives. Could you elaborate a little on that, as well as just general risk exposure to global supply chains due to enduring diplomatic tensions in the region? And Kayvon from the Canadian Embassy.
I have been visited by 2 or 3 Japanese delegations over the years that were very concerned about China's efforts to corner rare earth metals and things like molybdenum, and you would know better all the chemicals. If the best possible answer I could give to your question is I have those presentations. They've shared them with me. I'd be happy to share them with you because they walk through in very nuanced detail of the amount of investments, the chemicals that they're trying to address the dependency they have with China on, and the United States has begun to think seriously about this as well now, launching our own program for some of these rare earth metals. That could be a possible way, by the way, out of this conflict. Maybe there's some kind of covenant we can come up with on a trilateral basis between Korea, Japan, and the United States to solve some mutual problems we have, both on the chemical dependencies and the rare earth metal side. But yeah, see me afterwards. I can share those details.
The lady right over here.
Hello, I'm Hyun-Young Park, Washington correspondent for 중앙일보 of South Korea. What is the Trump administration stance on this issue? Because Ministry of Defense has displayed their disappointment on this GSOMIA issue, but they sort of left out this economic tension. They didn't want to mention anything about it. And does the Trump administration have plans and will to mediate? I'm asking because I speak to experts and they say that President Trump would not be interested in anything that doesn't earn him points in the next election. And obviously, Korea-Japan economic tension would not mean much to his domestic national politics. And I've just learned that from Lori that the Congress is just starting to learn about this issue, which means not much development has been taken in the administration or the Hill. So from each of your perspective, in reality, does the U.S. really have intention or will to mediate?
I mean,
No.
yeah, the only thing I would add is to sort of piggyback off of, Lori's comment of that, Capitol Hill starts paying attention when prices go up. And we don't know how this will play out, but if things were to go bad and prices were to go up because of a shortage of semiconductors and everything, then maybe that gets the president's attention, because heading to election, the last thing you want is consumer prices going up. But obviously, we don't want to get to that point either. So, yeah.
But this speaks to the broader lacuna in an important aspect of Trump's trade policy, and that's, if we're taking leadership in driving greater global integration of the global economy on a market-led, rules-based approach, we'd have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'd have mechanisms in place across the Asia-Pacific where we can bring like-minded countries together for a greater, deeper platform for trade integration. And the fact that we have elected to not avail ourselves of the possibility to participate in those relationships that denigrates and denudes our ability to influence Asian Pacific economic and national security affairs, especially if a goal of the Trump administration was to encourage U.S. enterprises to seek alternative location protections outside of China. The very first thing you should have done was conclude the TPP so that it's an attractive environment for companies to go to Korea, or to Vietnam, or to Malaysia, or Japan and Korea ultimately. So we have a approach, I would argue, with regard to trade in the White House that is disconnected from our broader economic interests, both nationally and across the global economy.
Yeah, Michael.
Mike Bassetti, get deeper into the internal politics. Looking at it from here, it seems like Moon's path is littered with banana peels, both internally and externally. I mean, he's had the scandals at home. Kim Dae-jung is not playing ball with him. And in terms of turning to Trump for help, I mean, every time Trump talks about South Korea, it's more about, raising, they should pay more for their defense and let's have fewer military exercises. Whereas Abe seems to be riding pretty high at the moment and seems to be in pretty firm control of his politics. But the comment about the coronation did raise the other question, that Akihito was a quiet and a reigning, not ruling emperor, but a force for peace and reconciliation in the region. And the new emperor, just by the nature of the fact he's new and young, just isn't going to be able to play that role.
Tammy.
I have a question for Stephen. Stephen, given that Korea produces 70% of the world's DRAM and 95% of the world's OLED, why aren't U.S. firms screaming? Why aren't they calling Lori every day going, y'all need to get the White House involved in this? Because doesn't everything use a screen? And don't we all depend on the semiconductors that our Korean friends provide to use those screens? What am I missing?
I would say you're not, actually. It's just that, the whole trickle-down effect hasn't occurred yet. So the fact that I'm just finding out this is a relatively new issue, and like I said, it's my boss is co-chair of the Korea caucus. I've been paying more, interestingly enough, I've been paying more attention on rare earth because we actually can produce some of the rare earth. And so I've been looking at designing a tax credit for my boss to start production in the United States. So I've been paying a little more attention on that front than this issue. And so, but yeah, like I said, we rule by crisis on Capitol Hill. And I think when prices start going up, and a number of these current trade skirmishes, or whatever, trade wars as we like to call them, until those really start impacting people, shopping, the average consumer up in Western PA, we don't, and that hasn't really started yet on Capitol Hill. I think it will, the longer some of these trade disputes, including this one, because it's right. I think most people see this as on Capitol Hill this is a trade dispute between Japan and Korea. This is not something impacting us, but this is where there is a disconnect between the global, the real global supply chain, which members on Capitol Hill don't know about. Most people don't know where products are made, and so I think this came up during the tax reform bill, when they were looking at the border adjustment tax. When we design a lot of clothes in in America, in New York, and San Francisco, but we only make 98 to 99% are made overseas in China, Vietnam, and it really was a real education for members when people started coming in, particularly on the tax writing committee, of what we actually make and what we don't make. And so I think that also is going to be very similar in this case with the screens, when all of a sudden, when it starts hitting us, and I can't get, my 12-year-old can't get his Xbox up and running on the latest. That's going to impact me, and I think it'll impact a number of members. So on Capitol Hill.
You can tell that Lori worked for the Industry Association, whereas I just work for the think tank. I would just add, I think certainly industry is expressing their voice on this issue. I would add, though, that also in the context of the U.S.-China trade conflict, as well as the administration's promulgation of our own export control rules, that I think industry has decided to be very discreet in its conversations with key players in the administration to reflect their concerns. Yes.
Steve Winters, an independent consultant. I think I'll direct this to Marcus. One of the South Korean officials who accompanied President Moon to the north said that the representatives of the North Koreans that they met were much more interested in talking to the representatives of the chaebol that President Moon brought along with him during that famous trip. And so that might indicate their view. So the question is, on the assumption, if it ever happened, that you got a close economic cooperation or agreement or peace on the Korean Peninsula, some people argue that this would be very much to the advantage of the South Korean groups such as Samsung, because they could absorb the working force in the North Korea, so forth and so on, so forth and so on. So how would you, from the economic perspective, if that comes to pass, how would that change the whole picture that we're talking about here today?
That's a hard question to answer, because it very much depends on the specifics. So let me just lay out kind of two counterbalancing forces, and then depending on exactly how it played out, one or the other might predominate, or might lead you to believe that such an outcome would be more or less beneficial. So the basic notion that the two economies are complementary, that South Korea has shrinking labor force, rising dependency ratio, could benefit from the ability to access reasonably numerate, literate, not necessarily skilled, but functional Korean-speaking workers, is obvious, as well as their ability to access natural resources in Korea. I mean, one of the things North Korea has is rare earths. So that kind of basic complementarity of the two economies is a true story. And if you could sort of magically wave a wand and they could sort of integrate without a lot of transaction costs or transition, it would be a big boost to both economies, especially the North. I mean, the North would be the primary beneficiary. it would have some adverse income and wealth effects in South Korea, unless policy was used to counterbalance it. So that story is pretty well known. I've done economic modeling on it. That's pretty easy. The harder part is this. Today, you could not do business in North Korea. I mean, doing business in North Korea means doing business with the North Korean state, right? I mean, especially if you're South Korean. The North Koreans assiduously control the South Koreans. The South Koreans have nowhere near the access that the Chinese do. And the North Koreans do this because, for understandable reasons, they are nervous about their population coming into contact with the South Koreans. And so the primary, historically, the two big projects have been Kaesong and Mount Kumgang, which literally are fenced off and subject to very strict control, and so on and so forth. South Korea, as we know, historically has had trouble with business-government relations, lack of transparency, and concerns, popular concerns, about the legitimacy of the chaebol and some of the big firms that you named. I mean, that's kind of how President Moon got elected. So when you talk about integrating the North and South economies, not only do you have all this great economic complementarities that could be beneficial, but you have the potential of really sending backwards business-government relations, corporate governance, and transparency in the Republic of Korea. Because involvement with the North is going to be highly politicized by nature and is likely to be highly corrupt. And so, you decide, is the kind of textbook benefit of economic integration, does that outweigh the likely political economy damage it will do? And then you decide, kind of on balance where it is. Then, once you do that, is this a kind of stronger peninsular economy, better able to deal with the Chinese or the Japanese or the Americans? Well, yeah. And would it benefit the United States? Yeah, I can calculate how much U.S. trade and investment would go up with the northern part of the Korean Peninsula if you had that kind of integration, along with the Japanese, the Russians, the Chinese, and who all. So, yeah, I mean, all these things are kind of long-term considerations. But in the case of South Korea, I think it really behooves South Korea to get its own house in order in terms of governance and be very careful in how it proceeds with economic integration with the North.
Ambassador Stevens, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks for the great presentations. I didn't hear anyone mention South Korea's export controls imposed on Japan, and so I assume they're minor, but I just wonder if someone could address that, if that has any impact at all. And kind of related to that, if, and I hope it doesn't happen, but if Japan and South Korea were to get into kind of a tit for tat, especially on the economic and trade side, what would you envision as kind of the menu they'd be looking at? Would it be in areas of actually trying to prevent or reduce other forms of trade or investment or exchange?
Okay, so does anybody know the answer to her first question? I don't. Okay, yeah, I know they did, but I can't tell you what the content was. Yeah, okay, so all right, no, it just means I'm ill-informed. The second question is really interesting. I mean, okay, so what would be the menu of tit for tat retaliations? I suspect, and this is purely speculative on my part, and confining it to the area of economics and hoping that it doesn't go kind of off into other areas. My guess is there would be a bunch of stuff on services, that there would be cultural restrictions, like basically the Japanese would ban K-pop and the South Koreans would ban, Japanese soap operas, right? I mean, it would be that, because that's the kind of, because you can appeal on nationalist grounds to protect your culture from, infection coming from, these terrible people. So I would expect that. Maybe some restrictions on tourism. I don't know, I should, but I don't know what the visa situation is. But you can monkey around with either not issuing visas or now requiring visas. And so you can hurt each other on tourism. I would expect that's where it would happen rather than straight up restrictions on trade, because straight up restrictions on trade would be subject to the WTO, whereas you could do some of the other stuff in ways that you might generate WTO cases, but they'd be less straightforward. You could come up with various rationales for why these kind of regulatory things you did that kept this service provider or that service provider out of your market could fly. I would think it would be that rather than just flat out, banning manufacturing trade or something. But who knows?
Just to add to that, Korea has already expressed interest in joining CPTPP officially, and that may prove more challenging should the ongoing tensions persist. And just to echo what Marcus said, actually Japan and Korea right now do not require short-term visa entry. So visas would certainly be something that would be restrictive. But again, it is damaging not just for one country, but for both countries. It's really shooting yourself in the foot. You can also see exchange programs in educational institutions as well, a cap or greater bureaucracy required to actually study in respective countries. Those are more bureaucracy, essentially.
I had thought that, so on August 12th, South Korea created a list of countries that do not abide by internationally accepted export controls and made Japan the first country on it. I had thought that was subsequent to Japan's having, yeah, okay, yeah. The only other comment I would make is, when you hear the Japanese tell it, they say, well, Taiwan's not on the white list, and there's no problem with the Taiwanese companies getting the chemicals they need. So the only point I would make, I'm not defending the Japanese position on that, is to say, at least in this particular narrow instance, is hopefully we cannot let a conflagration ensue that may make it more difficult to backtrack. And if there can be a situation, of course, where the Korean companies can continue to function with the supply of the materials they need, as long as Japan is committed to truly treating Korean suppliers the same way it treats Taiwan and other countries that are not on the white list.
Scott, right here.
Thank you. Scott Seaman with Eurasia Group. You actually just covered half of my question, but the first half was, what have you heard, if anything, about the trajectory of the court cases and when and if Japanese assets will be liquidated? I've heard that probably won't happen this year, but maybe next year, but I don't even know if it's a real risk or if it's just something that we don't need to worry about in the near term. But just like to hear your views on that.
So in the last week, I knew I was coming to speak on this panel, and I had the opportunity to meet with some prominent South Korean friends of mine. So of course, I asked them all these questions, it's kind of bone up, and they had a pretty cynical view of this. They basically said it's going to be tied to the elections. And so the way that, and unfortunately I'm jet lagged, I can't, kind of recount the exact, sequencing of these things. But they said basically it's all just tied to the electoral calendar. And so you kind of hold off on this thing until you get through this election, and then you wait and see what happens in the Japanese upper house elections, and, blah, 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 blah. But I think a common thread was, if South Korea started seizing property, that would just take it to a different level in Japan. The Japanese would go through the ceiling. And that's when you would set off real retaliation. And, they probably have a list of things that they're already thinking about right now in Tokyo.
You mean the National Assembly elections?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and since it's public, I'll just say there is a Nikkei Asian Review story from maybe early August. It sort of goes through the history on the Japanese side of this, where they talk to people in METI off the record and everything. And it does kind of list other areas, one of which is just tariffs on goods that they considered doing to South Korea before they settled on this specific one. So they have, I guess, thought through other options.
And this wasn't the court case you had in mind, but just with reference to the WTO dispute and Marcus's comment on it earlier, we just finally had a WTO resolution with regard to the Boeing-Airbus dispute, which was initiated in 2004. So it's 15 years before there was even any kind of ability for the U.S. to be authorized to pursue countervailable duty. So, and also the WTO can only adjudicate 24 cases a year, given its current staffing level. So I don't see much succor that Korea is going to be able to get out of its dispute with the WTO here.
Yes, right here in the front row.
I'm Eugene Kim, an Asan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. My question is to Shioko. It seems like all the panelists agree that the more U.S. engagements is needed to solve this matter. Then how do you assess Obama administration's engagement in sex slavery agreement a few years ago? Yeah.
So the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement, as was mentioned, was really pushed ahead at a ministry-to-ministry level by the foreign ministries. The Obama administration played a pivotal role in ensuring that met the year-end deadline that they had set. The Obama administration had played a key role in ensuring that the two sides actually met as well. So it did do a lot, but then here's the thing, what has it actually accomplished, right? So the treaty has been scrapped, the relationship continues to deteriorate, expectations for the United States to actually intervene are continuing to wane. Again, that is not to say that in the defense and the diplomatic fields there isn't great wariness of what's going on. But what I am hearing from U.S. government officials is that the United States can't want it more, can't want better relations more than Japan or from Korea. And right now, the appetite on the two sides is pretty weak. And that had not necessarily been the case under the Obama administration. So we can talk about why that is the case. But I do also feel that perhaps had the United States remained in the TPP, had the United States been more active in having a more multilateral approach to diplomacy, to trade, to international relations writ large, then perhaps this might have not escalated to the extent it has. So, thanks.
All right, well, thank you. I don't see any other questions. I think we've had a really great informative discussion here. I'd like to thank all the panelists who joined me in thanking them. This has been a great talk. Thank you.